It's election day, but before we consider how we should cast our vote, if it's not too late already, and I appreciate some of you will have already joined the throngs queuing up outside the Pallant Centre, our local polling station, but before we get into how you might cast your vote, we need to do a bit of theology first. From that reading that Sandra just gave us from the Gospel of Matthew, when the crowd saw that Jesus had the power to heal and to forgive sins, they were, and I quote, filled with awe and glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. It's a fascinating observation for Bible nerds that it's very easy for us to focus on Jesus' divinity in our prayers and in our thinking, but his humanity doesn't often appear front and center to us as often as perhaps it should. This is despite how many times Jesus himself uses the phrase Son of Man to describe himself. But the phrase here that Matthew tells us is that those around were filled with awe because God had given such authority, i.e. authority to heal and to forgive sins, to humanity in the form of Jesus. It's a theme Matthew pursues later in his gospel, specifically at the Great Commission in chapter 28, where Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And then he commands his followers to go out into the world and to baptize and teach the words of Jesus. According to the psalmist, that first reading that Sandra read, the law of the Lord, if you like, the authority of the Lord, is perfect. The statutes of the Lord are right, and they rejoice the heart, says the psalmist. The commandment of the Lord is pure and gives light to the eyes, says the psalmist. And in doing so, he sets up the presumption that in God and in God's laws, we can find the purest, the most noble, the most efficacious expression of how to live. Of God's judgments, the psalmist says, more to be desired are they than gold, more than much fine gold. They are also sweeter than honey, dripping from the honeycomb. He's talking about God's judgments with such beautiful metaphors. God's kingdom laws are therefore set up for us as an ideal, as an icon, as an inspiration for all human lawmaking. And yet, according to Matthew's gospel, God has given authority to human beings through Jesus, who is our master, but is also our brother. We share with Jesus the responsibility of enacting God's laws in the world. He's commanded us to go into the world, baptizing the nations and teaching them everything that I have taught you, says Jesus. Especially, we can wisely deduce, about the laws of God. Now, this idea that God's laws get enacted through faithful human beings goes right back to the Genesis story, or the Genesis myth, as I prefer to call it, in which God gives Adam dominion over the world while also commanding him to take care of it. So what do we mean when we speak of God's law? How shall we know on this election day which of the political parties on offer are enacting God's laws? How shall we judge where to put our voter's cross so that the cross of Christ may triumph over our nation? I wonder. Here's a story. Jesus wasn't the only rabbi, teacher, who was doing the rounds in that first century of our common era. At the time of Jesus, there was another well-respected teacher called Rabbi Hillel. And according to certain Jewish sources, Hillel was once challenged to stand on one leg and recite the laws of God. And it's not entirely clear why he was so challenged to stand on one leg, but presumably his challenger wanted Hillel to come up with a brief summary of the law before he fell over. Yeah, you get the idea? So Hillel took up the challenge, and he did indeed stand on one leg, and he said this: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. All the rest is commentary. It's quite profound, isn't it? In doing so, he quoted that same golden rule that Jesus also taught, the Shema, as the Jews call it, that we hear at the beginning of every service that we share on a Thursday. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, etc. You shall love God and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If we ever wanted to look for evidence that God has planted his law in our hearts, then the golden rule, as it's called, love your neighbor as yourself, is one that's shared across religions all around the world. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Or rather, sometimes expressed in negative terms, don't do to others what you do not want them to do to you. But the essential core is the same. Do as you would be done by. Love others as you yourself would want to be loved. This then, according to Jesus, who quotes the Shema, according to Rabbi Hillel, preaching at the same time, this then is the core of the law of God. If we want to understand what God's law looks like, we look to the golden rule: love for God and love for others. Any human law that does not in some respect reflect the golden rule is therefore something of which we should be rightly suspicious. How much does the notion of loving our neighbor get reflected in the political manifestos we have read? Now, this is easy to say, but perhaps not so easy to apply to the plethora of political manifestos that we have in front of us as we vote today. But do you know, I think it is possible to hold up the parties' manifestos to the golden rule. It's possible to take each area of our national life and our national policy making and ask, to what extent do they reflect God's law of love? Take, for example, the issue of justice. We know we have a justice system in crisis at the moment. We know we have prison governors who are worrying about where to put new prisoners. Just this week, talking about a one in and one out policy because they have no more space. Just think about that, our justice policy at the moment. We might ask, if we're applying the rule of the law of God, the golden rule, we might ask, does justice policy reflect the desire to punish and take retribution against evildoers? Or, rule of love, is it slanted towards forgiveness and restoration and hope for both criminals and for their victims? Take the troublesome issue of immigration. Is our immigration policy designed to show love to our foreign neighbors? Or does it stigmatize them and place unfair blame upon them for the failures of our own political systems? Take our education and health systems. Do we pay our teachers and our medical staff as we would expect to be paid if we were doing the same remarkable jobs that they do. You know? Treat others as you yourself would be treated. Do unto others as you would be done by. Don't do to others what you wouldn't do to yourself or want done to yourself. Do we pay our nurses and our teachers enough to have a reasonable standard of living, not to fret about every penny, and to be able to focus all their attention and their love upon the people that they care for, the children or the sick? We can go through all of the government's major areas of focus, and we can apply this golden rule to the question. How about our energy policies? Is there justice and equity between those who provide energy and those who pay for it? Or is it the case that our energy producers ignore the law of love, the law of doing as they would be done by? Do you get me? Do you get what I'm saying? I think the law of love can and should be applied to all our political thinking. So I'm going to take the unusual step this morning of recommending how you should vote today. Note how you should vote, not who you should vote for. That's up to you. But if you have not already cast your ballot, and I appreciate it's too late for some, I urge you to vote for whichever party, in your view, whose manifesto promises, when held up to the golden rule, most closely aligns to that principle of do as you would be done by, of loving your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Any party whose promises align to that principle is worth our consideration. Any party whose promises prioritize the needs of one group of people over others, I would argue, should be rejected. And so, if taxpayers, for example, are shown more love than the people who are on benefits and need our help and support, then we should question such a policy. If foreigners are shown less love than natural-born countrymen, we should question it. If certain groups in society, I don't know, maybe bankers and financiers, are given more advantage in life than every man, then we should question it. If the love we offer our neighbours through healthcare and education is to be done on a shoestring so that taxpayers can afford an extra Costa coffee a week, then we should question it. If energy policy veers towards destroying the planet instead of caring for it, as God commanded Adam, then for the love of all humanity, we should reject that energy policy. Apply the golden rule, my friends, to every political promise, to every political policy, every political claim, and do unto others as you would have them do to you. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the rest is commentary. Amen.